Welcome back to Going 5D with Destiny Dawn. I'm your host, Destiny Dawn. And yes, that is my real name, by the way. I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you to my lovely producer, Eve, who is doing all of the work behind the scenes here and on the website. Thank you, Eve. Today, we are going to be discussing everything alien, other than border control, because trust me when I tell you, you do not want my opinion on that. But have you ever looked out into the night sky and wondered if we are not alone in the universe? Or questioned the existence of other realities residing alongside or parallel to our own? If you said yes, then you have found yourself in the right place. Right now, the exact moment you need to be in the universe. At least that's my belief. Not just because I love having others to share and exchange my thoughts with, but because at this point in my journey, I'm inclined to believe that there is no such thing as coincidence. I expect that this will be my most difficult episode. And as such, I thought a lot about how I would approach it. In consideration of that, a funny commentary came to mind for the original Ghostbusters film. Just popped right into my head. I believe it was Ivan Reitman who said that he had to start simply and build the story up layer by layer before expecting the audience to just simply buy into the existence of ghosts and the story as a whole, especially at that time. So I thought about that. Just like math or reading, that made a lot of sense to me. And then it occurred to me as I was trying to think of how I would explain my perspective to the world. Now here we are. The best way I can think of to do that is just to simply walk you through some of my stories and my journey, sharing enough of it for you to understand how or why I was led to the conclusions that I've come to, while also leaving enough room for you to ask more questions and hopefully experience some of those profound moments for yourselves, whether going along the same path or something different. We're going to cover some of the most obvious questions that you probably have. Understand though, my goal is and never will be to persuade you to believe as I do. I'm here to be part of the conversation and maybe even help point some of you in the right direction that are kind of into the same things, just as I was, because that's what I know. It's what makes me me, my opinions and my beliefs are who I am today. My logic might not resonate with you, and that's okay. We can still be friends. My intention here is to contribute to the conversations going on around the world that are of interest to me, because I believe doing so also helps to create a safe space for others who are open to and interested in them, while also furthering the conversations themselves. That is what I want. So after we talk about me and my story and getting to where I am, we'll go over some questions, and then I'm going to pose some questions to you, my audience, for you to consider. Hopefully we can circle back later to this conversation in another episode, but we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. When I was in my 20s, my father-in-law died suddenly in his sleep. It was tragic. He was actually pretty young. I want to say maybe his 50s, early 60s, and otherwise pretty healthy. It actually kind of fucked with me. It was just out of nowhere. I suddenly just had this overwhelming fear of dying after that, especially in my sleep. And it just kept getting worse. After being terrified of falling asleep for weeks, I started to feel like shit, and I started being scared when I was awake. It eventually became difficult for me to even leave my house. I went to the doctor, and of course they wanted to give me pills, which I had already tried once when they gave me depression pills after I had my baby, and it just gave me a raging headache, and I put on 30 pounds, so the idea just pissed me off. I insisted it was something that I just needed to work through, because that's how I work. My grandma had already spent a couple of weeks on the phone late at night with me, and although I do look back on that time, and I'm so thankful that she did, because my grandma Lola would end up dying a few years later. Those talks meant the world to me now, but they didn't actually help then. It was weeks later, before while waiting on a referral, that I would meet this amazing counselor who listened to what had happened, what I'd been going through. He referred to this desensitization therapy and recommended we did that. Of course, I didn't like the sound of it, but it made sense as to why that was needed. It was also around the same time I was just starting to get back into the paranormal world again. I had been honest about that being a potential factor, but he asked good questions and determined it was not likely that was what was plaguing me, since that was something that at some capacity had been in my world for a very long time, no matter how much I had tried avoiding it. Of course, he did say he wanted to discuss that separately later, but he didn't actually give me a hard time about it. So we set a date, and I got excited, nervously excited, but excited nonetheless. And a few weeks later, the day finally came. I showed back up to his little clinic downtown, but it was strangely empty. There was nobody in the parking lot. As I approached the door, it was locked. I called, there was no answer, not even a voicemail option to leave a message. It was the weirdest damn thing. It was like it was suddenly just gone. Needless to say, we would not get to complete our session. I reached out to my doctor's office, and as it turned out, he freaking died right after we met. Can you believe it? Not gonna lie, that really fucked with me. I thought it was really odd, but I also can't say I was super shocked because he did look super old. He had to have been like 80 something at least. Either way, I had just started a job and I was afflicted with this issue, and depression sucked. Living in fear did not look good on me. I was over it, and I wanted to get past that hurdle sooner than later. But the last thing I wanted was to have to go through explaining it all over to someone else and then hope that they give me a good answer. Partly for fear of getting a different answer that didn't resonate with me. I think they call it exposure therapy now, I'm not sure. But either way, what the old man had said felt right. So I read everything I could about it back then. This was like 2007, 2008. I forced myself to sit and consider what it would feel like to die. I think it was just one day I happened to be by myself, and I just thought, let's do this. And, I thought of all the different ways of dying, which kind of, now looking back, reminds me of Final Destination. But it was very much like that. I had seen this show, right around that time maybe, called Dead Like Me, and a couple other things. I knew that I would want to leave my body. So I assumed in this scenario that I had left my body before it happened, because I didn't want to be traumatized and stuck here, which seems to happen frequently in the paranormal world, since that's what ghosts are. I'd also read a lot of Sylvia Browne back then, so I just resonated with that. But I considered what life would be like for my daughter, my family, my friends, what would happen with my stuff, where it would go, and if I would leave behind any kind of legacy, how would people remember me? I came out feeling more determined than ever to do better than I had ever done, to be the kind of person that people would miss after I died, leave a legacy of something meaningful. And I guess that's what I took away from that, was that facing my fears made me realize that the world was just going to keep on spinning, even if I wasn't in it anymore. But if there was something I could take away from it, it was about being a better person, not just being nicer, but leaving a legacy behind, because it occurred to me in doing that I didn't really have one. I didn't have a lot of stuff even. I guess you could say that that's been something pretty important to me ever since. I think just as I was meant to experience that we as a society have to go through certain motions to get where we are as well. Fast forward to 2021. A lot had been going on. I'd kept myself busy at work. I was doing pretty well from my perspective. Work was pretty much my only solace from politics, COVID, And then several people died within a couple of months, a very short span of time. It was all really taking its toll on me. Work was stressful. I was happy and felt accomplished, but I was put into this awkward position in a role created specifically for me, where I was promoted, bypassing the normal path that others had, my colleagues, to get to such a position, which caused a lot of tension and, combined with already existing communication issues, resulted in a lot of tension. It dawned on me in one meeting in particular that was unpleasant, that I could not help these people in the best way I knew how, that I would have to play their silly game while I figured out a way to get out of the position I was in, literally and figuratively. This snowball effect of negativity just really broke me, though. All I wanted to do was hide away, but there was no way that would be possible for the foreseeable future. I had a team that I didn't want to leave behind. I had responsibilities that were important to me. I just felt stuck. That's when a previous client, the same one with the nasty attachment I spoke about in my first episode, reached out to me asking for help once again. It had been a few years since we'd removed the attachment, and he was feeling its presence again. Not like before, but enough that he felt compelled to reach out to me. And in some ways, it was the best of time and the worst time, because I guess it gave me something else to focus on, but that's, at the time, felt like the last thing that I needed. But I was compelled to help him, one way or the other. Now, as a way to cope with all the other stuff that was going on, I had begun researching and practicing simple guided meditations, looking first on YouTube and Spotify. I was trying to practice calming my mind, but was having a lot of trouble finding time. So this just made that harder. Now I know that was just part of starting any new habit, but I felt this sense of urgency to even get that done faster. Often found myself thinking about my client and how I was going to help him, which I have to say I was pretty intimidated by, not so much for myself, but for the people around me, and a failure. Since the last time I'd helped this man, my daughter had been attacked twice, actually. I was honestly worried about the likelihood of something like that happening again, or to the victim, my client. So I was compelled to figure out how to face this thing on my own, because at that point, I didn't have anyone left on my team. Everyone had kind of gone their separate ways, which is what I thought I was going to have to do at that time. So I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but I just kept thinking I was going to have to face this thing head on. And as strange as it sounds, it was the first time that I'd ever thought to myself about what it actually was that I was facing. Each person that I had worked with along the way had their own explanations about how things work, but I always stayed neutral, and I'd always intended to form my own opinion once I'd gathered enough information to, though I never really consciously considered it until that moment. I thought back to the first time I'd met up with a client and how odd the pictures were that I had taken while I was there. It was almost as though there was something scurrying around the rooftops of the shops he had on his property. In the photos, it looked like a kind of blur that you see coming up from a campfire. Like in one particular image, it almost looked like the outline of like a couple of different creatures like crawling or scurrying. And my colleague at the time, who was helping me, insisted that they were not our problem, that they were elementals and best left alone. Still, for whatever reason, I could not put that experience out of my mind. What was I dealing with, and how could I protect everyone? What were demons? What were elementals? I felt as though my understanding of ghosts and spirits were pretty solid, but why did it all feel connected? And if they were, how? I sat with this as I was learning to meditate. I got better and better at learning how to have just one thought. At first, having to sort it all out, like the fleeting thoughts drifting through my mind. It was frustrating. The guided meditations seemed to go too fast, making it seem impossible to see the things that they would instruct me to visualize. So I was so frustrated with myself and focused so much attention on how to meditate at first, it hadn't occurred to me that this time that I was spending thinking about this thing was actually helping me slowly learn to do exactly that, focusing on solving problems, floating through my mind, then on to the next and on to the next until there was nothing left but what I came to think about in the first place. After several weeks, it occurred to me that the thing they all had in common was that, like humans, they were all just different forms of animals, some just more primal than others. Once this realization came to me, I explored that further and wondered if they too feed on energy sources like we do, which explained why I was told not to bother with the creatures scurrying around. Perhaps they would do no harm if left alone. But what if a non-corporeal animal did not need physical energy like we do? Would it still try to feed? Or could it imbibe energy in some other way? Perhaps not because it needed it for sustenance, but maybe for other purposes? Which led me to wonder if maybe energy just feels good or does something else, like gives it strength of some other kind. That might be difficult to understand unless you were that kind of being. In any case, I had been thinking a lot about this, and I knew that one way or another, I needed to do some spiritual inner work. Of course, with no idea how. While learning that, there were all these different kinds of meditations too. So I decided to take my efforts a step further and began studying the philosophies associated with different kinds. The one that stuck out to me in particular was Kundalini. I really liked learning about that. After going to great lengths to avoid the imminent threat that was COVID, I tested positive. That would have been January 2022. Upon showing up for work, I felt, kind of crappy. And then they sent me home because that's how the restrictions were in Washington at the time. When in doubt, go home. Well, I felt fine the first day, kind of laughed it off, just thankful for the time off. I had decided to download this app that was recommended to me probably based on all my recent Google searches called Gaia, which seemed to be a great resource for quality guided meditations, which is kind of what I was hoping for. It had meditations, yoga, things like that, and they were better quality as a premium streaming service, no ads, so super cool. I spent the remainder of that afternoon browsing their programming, listen a little bit. What I like to do is I like to listen to them and then check it out before actually doing it, because I had become annoyed with stopping at partway in, not liking it, and having to start all over. It was time consuming. So I would listen to them while I was doing other stuff like cleaning the house or driving or whatever. And there were a couple that I really liked and decided to try, which I did. So the next day, feeling pretty relaxed, especially after doing a couple of them, I drifted off to sleep and let the next one run, listening to it in the background. The music is always really nice. Like most streaming services, this one automatically goes to the next episode. So I'm not sure how it decided to start an entirely different program, but that's exactly what happened. I woke up to hearing people actually talking, which is not what I was expecting. I was expecting this soothing, meditative talking, guiding you through. No, it wasn't anything like that. Turns out it was a show hosted by a man named Ruben Langdon. A series called Interviews with Extradimensionals, not knowing what the heck I was watching and half zoned out. It was like someone had heard me asking myself all of those questions and hearing that inner dialogue about physical and non-physical beings, and the answers just magically appearing before me. To be honest, the first time watching it was kind of a blur, but I just remember waking up briefly, catching a few minutes before passing out again, but not really having a clue about what the show was. I just liked what they were talking about. whatever it was on was interesting enough that I made a mental note to go back and check it out again. But then the COVID took over and I basically just power slept for the next couple of days. Eventually, I tracked down my recently watched list and would spend the next several days watching at least a few episodes a day before my family would get home from work or school. My husband was interested, or at least placated me, but not enough to actually spend time watching any of the episodes with me. So I would slowly binge watch by myself. Here's where it gets weird. So when I went back to watch these, and I'm just going to kind of cover the first couple of episodes, but they go into a lot of stuff. The premise to the show is about channelers that are being interviewed by Reuben Langdon while channeling extra-dimensional beings. Now, I was familiar with the concept of like mediumship and mediums, and it even met a few legitimate ones that I really enjoyed working with over the years. But this was different. Mainly because the messages were not specific to a certain individual, but more so concepts that made sense to all those questions that I had been exploring, like pieces of a puzzle, some that I considered previously and for others I've forgotten about, and then others that that had never even previously occurred to me. It all came together in this special, loving way. So here's a few key points that I wanted to kind of go over, because this is what really intrigued me and kept me interested. So they talked about how the Earth was a galactic melting pot. Now that was one I had discussed with other people previously, not thought specifically about it in the context of aliens. I had previously considered the likelihood of asteroids hitting the planet, especially in the early stages of life on Earth. And I had even joked before that Earth was probably a petri dish. All beings having access to tapping into the collective consciousness was something else that they talked about too. And this was a relatively new concept to me. That had been touched on in my meditation studies, but explained in a way here that brought it all together. From universal consciousness, referred to as source energy, to the Earth Collective or other collectives throughout the universe. Then to smaller ones within the Earth Collective, like soul groups. They also talked about what ego is and what it isn't. How it helps us on one hand, particularly to live and thrive within this third dimensional reality we currently reside, but also why and how to expand beyond it. This too was discussed in relation to my meditative studies, but again, this was by far the best and most digestible explanation. I loved how they discussed these concepts, extra dimensionals, all of these different beings and species from throughout the universe, as well as spirituality interchangeably. It felt very natural and resonated deeply with me. There was a reference made about Lyrans also establishing Lemuria over 3,000 years ago. And for whatever reason, I just felt this wave of energy running through me. It pinged me. I've always been fascinated by Lemuria, and that alone would have hooked me. They also talked about timelines, creation, ancient civilizations, multidimensionality. I won't lie, I was and would start to see more of this being referenced in movies and on television too, but this was on a whole new level. One theme that was often discussed too was how the third dimension was created in order to experience the physical. And it's funny because that was a couple of years back, and I actually just heard a podcast or some video I found on YouTube with Neil deGrasse Tyson where this is discussed. And that in doing so, going back to the show now, they were saying that in doing so, it was necessary to build in limitations from accessing other outside information. So basically that being in physical form was done intentionally in a way that would limit us to focusing on the physical. and keeping us from accessing information or memories from our other incarnations, at least until the individual was ready or it was a good time for that data to be brought into their awareness. The idea being that this would give each individual like adequate time and space to experience things that they came here to do or participate in. That blew my mind. Another thing, that one thing people like often question is their purpose, and that decisions made leading up to the present, that every now moment was and is the right choice, since reframing it from good versus bad and replacing those constructs with lessons learned makes it easier for us to process, digest, and then move on to the next lesson. And that was another one, because it made understanding this and a whole bunch of other stuff from leading up to that point make a lot more sense. You know, a lot of people question their purpose. And a lot of people question if what they're doing right now is really what they want or should be doing. And that really, resonated with me, especially at that point in time. That we choose the most important lessons that we want to learn before incarnating from a higher perspective. Before we've been conditioned, programmed, traumatized, and scared into the belief systems that we have. From this broader perspective, they talked about that we can see how and why things, emotional attachments or baggage, as I see, will affect us going forward. That right there was also a profound moment for me, because I thought to myself a lot about, well, how did I create my journey? What kind of journey or experiences did I set out for myself? And then looking back, I could see several different really important lessons that happened in a way that made sense to me, like as if I had planned that ahead of time. I could totally see that. Also, that an individual fractal of ourselves descend into our current incarnations in order to be here and learn about those lessons, which I would later learn about being referred to as an oversoul, which is usually living in like multiple incarnations at the same time. Blew my fucking mind. So if you hadn't already had me, at this point, stick a fork in me, because the idea of me having other lifetimes, other incarnations at different points in time, all at the same time, was like, it was crazy. Also, that the oversoul belongs to a higher frequency or vibration. So that this is the part that determines like those lessons and experiences from that broader perspective. But not just that, but that they're also ultimately the executive decision maker in our journey. That's our higher consciousness. Something else they talk a lot about in meditation, that they determine or change course as needed based upon if something will ultimately benefit you or affect the journeys ahead of you. Interesting. I didn't really have a lot of opinions about that, because after wrapping my mind around the last thing, it just made sense. That the place entities come from is usually from the 9th dimension or higher, meaning that while it can and does fractalize to have those experiences, the part of that that is not incarnated stores all of the information that you've gathered in all of your lifetimes. That this higher aspect of yourself belongs to a greater consciousness. And in our case, it would be the Earth collective consciousness. I actually really like learning about that, because the idea of belonging to this collective consciousness makes sense to me. We kind of go through things together, don't you think? At a certain level, like we on Earth have been through a lot of shit just since I've been alive. Together. Like it or not, we do go through things together. And I think understanding that we go through things together helps make it make sense in terms of how we have to, or how we should, go through things together going forward. From that vantage point, we work with other oversouls and contract to help each other learn lessons that will help us progress at an individual and collective level. In doing so, we exchange control from time to time, often handing it over from one to another so that we can experience both sides of any given experience, which is referred to as karma. Those lessons that we come here to learn, which are for the greater benefit of all participants and generally require multiple incarnations in order to overcome and integrate the information and lessons that we all came here to learn. People use karma in the wrong context, I would like to point out. This seems like a really great time. I hear people pointing karma out as though it were something to do with like vengeance or retribution, and it's not that at all. And I knew that a long time ago, that karma was about lessons. They talked about that in my meditative stuff too, so this just really made sense to me. And that while fear and pain are unpleasant lessons, they too are neither good nor bad, in the same way that good or evil do not really exist. This was easy for me to understand. They're just lessons. For example, to explore the victim and perpetrator roles. If you experienced victimhood in one incarnation, you would likely return to the shoe being on the other foot, somehow victimizing an individual who had victimized you previously. In short, we create drama and situations that we encounter. The challenge is learning how to navigate through them successfully while learning the intended lessons that they contain. Your level of frequency determines what you will attract, outside of the main themes intended for each lifetime. If you move through those lessons with ease, you will master them quickly and invite more, often less challenging ones, because you're open to them. Just like in the example given in one episode with a painter, they talked about how, let's say you come into this lifetime and you plan on being a painter, and your favorite color is red. So you use a lot of reds in your painting, and you attract a lot of people who really like those paintings. But something happens that makes you change the way that you feel about the red, and you decide at some point you don't want to do the red paintings anymore. You want to focus more on blue. Blue is now more your vibe, right? We're meant to be able to shift from one way of thinking to another way of thinking, right? And so if you had stuck with the red because it's familiar and you know that it will at least generate some success, you will stay where you are, and any negative feelings associated with it will continue circling back to you, limiting your expansion. Whereas changing your repertoire could lead you to feeling more passionate about what you are doing. You're going to love doing those blue paintings, thus carrying that energetic signature that will resonate with an even wider audience and lead to other opportunities down the road. And that has to do with the law of attraction too, which is another concept discussed frequently on that show. And we'll touch more on that later on too. But I realize I jumped pretty far down that rabbit hole and gave you a lot of information about those shows. And it's funny because that's like just the first 2 or 3 episodes. But for good reason. Not only did I want an excuse to talk about those things, but the takeaway here is that I came from a very spiritual perspective. Those things resonated with me. The people were also talking often about various types of beings originating from all over the universe, with at least one aspect of themselves residing here on Earth, many of whom could be called or considered star seeds, light workers, indigo children. Some have been here for eons and have been caught up in the cycle of karma for so long that they are traumatized at a soul level, which is why so many have been brought at this time, because they were either here before, left, and then came back, or they've just come recently for the first time in order to help us during this time of great upheaval and transition. So having watched much of the series by the time I went back to work, I felt rested, reinvigorated, like I really just needed to hear that, I guess. It just clicked with me in a whole bunch of different ways while helping me to better understand channeling, not being just exclusive to ghosts and spirits. And I was honestly hoping I could figure it out for myself. But just as I am apparently not meant to see extra dimensional beings, I am also not meant to have direct interface or channel with them, at least yet either. In any case, that series prompted me to want to see what I would now refer to as extra dimensionals from the outside perspective, like most people do, in the form of what we have come to know as aliens. I did the same thing with politics and the COVID stuff and all kinds of stuff that had been going on. So kind of prepared me for this, because going into all of that, part of what had pained me so much in relation to it was all of these conversations were, fueled by everything that was going on and pissing people off, and everybody was picking sides. But it didn't make sense to me to just pick a side based on what my preference was or the little information I knew about it going in. It made sense to me to go and do my research. So that's what I did. I went and did my research. I'd barely scratched the surface before stumbling upon all of this conspiracy theory stuff out there, reminding me of what my husband would tell me early on in our relationship. It was then that it dawned on me that he had been right all along. Conspiracy theories were not really of interest to me, though, especially now, since these new revelations explained, I felt like, a lot about why it had been the right time for that reality to be brought into our awareness, and why there was some hesitation leading up to that. It was like what another great channel I watched had likened it to. I'll get to that in a minute. But based on my views regarding religion especially, it was pretty obvious to me that applied to this too. That many narratives had been created to suit the status quo at the time. And that was not the focus in my research, though I will touch on that a bit later too. What did intrigue me was that there were a lot of scientists, actually, that have spoken about some of these principles from a scientific perspective, less so spiritual. But if you search for something like living in a matrix or dimensional realities, you can find a lot of videos from prominent scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, even Stephen Hawking. You will find their theories are not far removed. For those of you wondering, what the hell those have to do with aliens, I got you. Aside from the fact that Neil deGrasse Tyson also talks about humans being made up of stardust, and my own previous experiences with what I now would consider to be extra-dimensional beings, there have also been countless sightings spanning millennia. Look at the History Channel, once known for its boring documentaries about previous world wars and such, and some ancient civilizations, till more and more focus on our past during a time when technology was rapidly advancing, resulting in a lot of discoveries about ancient civilizations that were only recently unearthed and publicized. I used to catch that once obscure show known as Ancient Aliens every now and then. Of course, I've now binge-watched most of the series. It has now become one of many platforms for scientists to explore and discuss the truth about what has been discovered. Combine that with cameras now being in the hands of most people around the world, on most street corners, and mounted in most aircraft, it becomes really hard to dismiss what all of these people are seeing and experiencing. Just last year, retired Major David Grush provided testimony to a Congressional House Oversight Committee regarding his concerns with non-disclosure of information related to the reverse engineering of UAPs that crashed in various locations and are currently being stored in undisclosed facilities, as well as their deceased pilots. People are stepping up. It's like, now that we have all of these technologies and now that we're all chatting online all the time together, people are like, oh, check out what I saw. Did you see that? you can't get away from it at a certain point. Then there are all the individual accounts of the sightings and experiences posted online. A simple search for UFO, UAP, or alien videos on Reddit or YouTube will bring up some very interesting results. Not to mention MUFON's website, or heck, even the Department of Defense for the United States, where they now have pages dedicated both to reporting sightings as well as validating the existence of videos shot by many within the military community, further lending credibility to what people all over the world have been saying for decades. I realize that some of you are still not convinced, and that's okay. I tell my stories because I know what it was like to be a non-believer and what they think about people that are. And it's not nice. I'm just going to be honest about that. Turns out I had been one of those people who were not remotely aware, much less interested in new information. Just like my former colleagues. I was no better than them, insisting that they understood how to do something and that their belief was right for them, not even entertaining the possibility of how additional information could be integrated and made useful to me later. I'm glad that things worked out the way that they did, but had I recognized that back then, I could have addressed the fact that we both believed that we knew how to do things, and all we needed to do was communicate. We could have worked through it. But as they say, it's meant to be. To make matters worse, though, I was completely dismissive in those discussions with the one person that I should have trusted more than anyone else, my husband. If you did not already believe and are either on the fence or are at the point where it does start to add up, know that these things take time in order to replace your previous understanding too. Not only as you process and integrate that new information, I get it. The shoe was on the other foot for me, and all I wanted to do was shout it out to the world, or at least to my husband, but he was kind of reacting in a similar way I had, but slightly nicer, just dismissive. He believed in all those things, but I had conditioned him to not talk about it. That was a hard pill to swallow, so that was a couple of hard pills to swallow. I had to take some time to reconcile with the fact that, holy shit, aliens exist, and that when you replace words like angels and demons with ones like aliens and extra dimensionals, the stories passed down from our ancestors start making way more sense. Here I was, up to my ass in aliens. See what I did there? So, stepping back a little bit, my husband was actually just starting to get into the writing of a book series we had both been working on together. He actually just finished the second book today, which had a way witchier vibe leading up to this. And now all I wanted to do was incorporate some of this information into that. So what did I do? My ass pled to him like I was on trial, admitting that I should have trusted him more back then and promising to try to do better going forward. I say all this because it's important for you all to understand that there was some serious inner work that had to be done here, and in a sense, a reckoning that had to be done during this time. I don't want you to just think that I was like walking away from this with everything that I had learned. I just gobbled it up and it immediately changed my life, because it doesn't work that way. As much as I wanted to shout it out to the world, it took me almost 2 years, and this is only going to be one episode. There is so much other shit that came after that. This is just one episode. It was an important episode, and that's why at the beginning I said I thought a lot about how I was going to approach this, because that's my journey in. As I mentioned, I've been absolutely obsessed with the idea of channeling ever since. I wanted to talk to these beings myself. Of course, that never happened, I don't think, but my efforts to try and figure it out led me to one of my favorite channelers, Lee Harris and the Z's, which was one of the channelers featured on Interviews with Extra Dimensionals. I had looked several of the channelers up, to be honest, but this was definitely one of the ones that really stuck out to me. I think my favorite of all of them. They just have this kind of gentle but firm way of explaining things that I really resonate with. If you haven't heard of them, I highly recommend doing some research on the internet. You could even go on YouTube. They have some free videos, I think, on there. As it happens, I had a lot of shadow work to do, and apparently that's like their specialty, or at least it seems that way from my perspective. But I wanted to cover this topic early on because my desire to understand these things in more depth and from other perspectives led me down a lot of other rabbit holes that will be discussed later on in this series. So it just made sense to get all of this out of the way. It should go without saying, I do not know the definitive answer to a lot of these questions, at least not one that's going to satisfy everybody. A simple Google search will help you find more information about this stuff and everything that I'm discussing here. If you want help or suggestions on where to look though, let me know. I'm always happy to help. I will include some stuff though as I go along. So first, some of you might be wondering, why the need for all the non-disclosure? Why the dishonesty in the knowledge and cover-ups in regards to UFOs, UAPs, whatever? Well, public fear. People mean well, but often act out violently when it's, the whole fight or flight mode triggered by fear or unpleasant stimuli. Then let's not forget religious institutions. They have been the teachers of what is and isn't heavenly for millennia. And the existence of extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional beings kind of throws a monkey wrench in that whole story. Unless, again, you replace words gods and angels with aliens, or extra-dimensionals, as I like to call them. Then the story seems to make a lot more sense. I know I pointed that out before, but the further implications for the religious bias is that millions of people have based their religious beliefs as the core central tenets of themselves as a human being, ceding their power to that of a jealous God. Without their religion, they would have to question everything. And their whole world might unravel as they go down that rabbit hole of information. I know some of us wish that they would just show up in ships or just reveal themselves one day, and then those people would have to do that instantaneously, but I don't think that's how it's going to work, unfortunately. But there's also the national security risks. Imagine the national security risks for government and protections for society of the masses of fearful people took to the streets. And let's be honest, we know that shit happens. Because, again, look at COVID. Look at the political shit that's been going on. We know that happens. I don't live far from Portland, Oregon, where, again, I know this shit happens. I was actually going to school in Portland when Donald Trump was elected president, and there were riots in the streets in Portland blocking cars. And I'm not in disagreement with these people, and they're still blocking my car. And I got off easy because there were some people that got their cars damaged. It was awful. People got hurt. That's the worst case scenario. And it happened pretty frequently. So we know that's a thing. As much as we don't want to believe it, we know that's a thing. We saw what thousands of people were willing to do when they believed the big lie of the whole stop the steal, produced by people that were actually trying to steal an election. They were willing to invade and infiltrate our nation's capital. Imagine what they would do if spaceships showed up in the sky. Their fear would immediately turn them into aggressors, and risk war with a species carrying advanced technology beyond our knowledge and understanding. Now, I don't actually think that they would do anything like that, but we have to at least consider that as a possibility. Not that they would go out and annihilate our species for people being douchebags, but again, people could get hurt. And even if I don't like them, I don't want them to get hurt. See where I'm going with that? I believe that some of our presidents in the past have known about the presence of these other earthly beings and entities that live and travel among us. And I also believe, because it would only make sense if that's the case, that deals would have been made with some of them. It makes sense to me that in order, like going back to the idea of, softballing it in and introducing concepts layer by layer, that you would take at least several decades in order to get to that point. That said, deals have been made with some of them, and advancements in technology have been the result primarily in the last 75, 80 years. So I do think that was kind of a quid pro quo. We turn the clock back and we rewind to the original exposure facts that came out of places like Roswell, New Mexico, and Wright-Patterson Airfield in Ohio, not to mention the recent disclosures from allies to the cause of the United States Navy and the United States Air Force about the ongoing investigations and documentation of these. Going back decades, perhaps even longer, who knows? Now, next question. Who are the ones flying around in these UAPs, and what do they want? The short answer is that I believe most of them are our ancestors, going way, way back. That there is a vested interest in the safety of our species. Between ongoing tensions with our leaders, dangerous scientific experiments, and perhaps even outside interference, I believe many of them are even patrolling our planet, occupying secret bases that exist either outside of our reality, which we'll discuss more about in another episode, or likely in the sky, under the oceans, as well as remote locations. So the next question would be, where did they originally come from? Well, I have a feeling that, though I could be wrong, most of them that we are seeing, like from before 2012, were already living here in the aforementioned areas. But that since 2012, there's been this huge shift in frequency. Now many more have come from all over the universe. Whether they've been living here with and alongside us, there are several species that are regularly discussed and seem well known about that I want to touch on. Now literally, you could do a Google search on any one of these races that I'm about to share with you, and you could probably find loads of information. I'm going to keep it to just a few that are the most common ones. And again, I am by no means an authority. But once I get done with that, I'm going to move right on. So I want to throw in, there is actually a really great website that you can go to. Her name is Debbie Solaris, and her website is Debbie, DebbieSolaris.com, DebbieSolaris.com. I don't want to go into all of these because I am not going to do them justice. It's not like other people who have spent their careers working on this stuff, because I haven't. So that said, the most common ones that get talked about, I would say the most, are going to be the Lyrans, the Arcturians, Pleiadians, the Draconians, the Syrians, and of course, the Greys. There's also insectoids too, but I don't hear that discussed quite as often. I don't know where all of them are from. I know I've read about where most of them are. It seems like the Greys are the most common ones, and they seem to be from all over, past, present, and future. So next you might be asking yourself, well, how long have they been among us? I say since the beginning of Earth, or pretty darn close. What implications does this have on the world and societal constructs, particularly surrounding religion? Well, we're going to talk about that more. But first, let's examine what we know. Sightings have been occurring all over the planet. The technology observed is obviously far beyond our own. You don't move as fast and at the angles that they do without having incredible technological speed and agility. This would indicate a far more advanced level of intelligence and technology. And I would like to point out, and this is kind of my answer to the religion question, what I had said in my first episode, which was this: if we as a pet owner who take care of our pets would require them to bow down and worship us, or to not speak against us every single day, to only idolize us and no one else. That just seems silly to me. That's like expecting this higher deity to do the same, and that just seems asinine to me. Would you require your dog to do that? I couldn't even imagine requiring my dog to do that. Even if he or she could have the capacity to idolize and worship me, wouldn't require it. I don't need that. Why would we think that somebody else does who's way more evolved and advanced than we are? Just seems silly to me. I just had to say that. Little sidetrack. Anyway, let's take a step back and wrap our minds around that journey and talk about why, by flipping the script a bit and playing a little game I like to call What If. And from there, I will point you to where you can find some more information, and then we'll get things wrapped up today. So, what if? What if our ancestors started documenting visitations from these beings thousands of years ago? What if they came from more than one place and helped seed the human race? What if they taught us some basic guidelines for which to live by? What if we took notes and wrote books based upon this knowledge, but somewhere along the way, leaders added new information to lead their cultures in the direction that they wanted to go? What if, over time, this evolved into what we know today to be Bibles and thus religion? What if many have used this as a means in which to control and manipulate the masses? What if we allowed this to happen because there were many valuable lessons to learn by being subjugated? I know it sucks to hear that, but going back to not really having a good or bad, there were a lot of lessons. Let's be honest. What if we have exhausted the war and victim/perpetrator scenario, and it's time for us to move on? What if what we are really afraid of is them treating us like we treat one another, and especially any creatures that we would consider to be beneath us evolutionarily? What if we are ready to evolve, but are struggling to cope with and overcome the trauma of our past? And what if light workers, star seeds, and other beings are helping us right now because we are experiencing trauma at a cellular level? And yes, I said that right. What if once we work through remaining karma, we will be ready for peace on earth? What if it's time to face our fears once and for all and think outside the box, letting go of all aspects of our past that no longer serve us and embracing one another as a collective? What if once we get there, our ancestors will officially make their presence known to us? Or we'll just be able to see them because we've kind of reached that frequency? What if that's already happening right now, gradually? That's my theory in a nutshell. So following along with that train of thought, what now? What are those implications of the very sobering questions that we have to ask ourselves about things like religion, who's in control, and what other information has been kept from us about our past, who we really are as a species, and if we are not living as a subjugated people? Do we truly understand what it means to be free? Next, let's explore that. Additionally, you've probably wondered why, if we have come so far in this evolutionary process of enlightenment, particularly with regard to our ability to be comfortable with the idea of the existence of aliens, do they not just show themselves? Without giving too much away, I believe it isn't that we aren't ready, but that we are still too divided and too hostile at the moment. Or at least that's the main reason. Maybe we aren't quite ready. That while we are close, it'll take a shift in our current paradigm for us to get there, which I believe will happen in one of two ways. Either we blow each other up, blow ourselves up, and those who rise up from the ashes will no longer follow the warmongering leaders across the world or the bullshit lies that they've been telling us for so long, or we'll figure out that for ourselves before it's too late recognizing that we don't need to worship anyone, that living in subjugation doesn't look good on us. It's a pointless waste of time at this point, and especially of an existence by beings that have the ability to change their reality at any time. Especially when we come together collectively and honor each other. Imagine doing that the same way that we would the deities we've been idolizing for all this time, or as I like to call them, messengers. Finally focusing our attention on the messages that they have to offer us, rather than the messengers themselves. It is my belief that we still have some things to work through, but that we are really close. I almost mentioned this earlier, but I have to. As Bashar, which is another entity channeled by Daryl Anka, I highly recommend you checking him out, wisely put it when asked, why don't they just show up, interact with us face to face? And I'm paraphrasing here. He said something to the effect of, would you just walk into an insane asylum and wake everybody up, especially knowing most of the residents were carrying guns and other weapons? No! Especially while we're still too traumatized. Even if we didn't just try to kill whatever scares us, we'd probably at least be too terrified at first to be open to the experience. That's me adding that in. For now, it seems like the interactions will happen on the down low and with people who are asking for or contracted prior to coming here, incarnating. But that conversation is for yet another day. Which leads me to next week's discussion about timelines, dimensions, and densities. What are they? Why should we care? And what do they have to do with extra-dimensional beings? Well, you'll have to join me next time to find out. But as promised, I would like to recommend checking out a couple of books. Stephen Hawking's A Short History of Time, Dolores Cannon's 3 Waves of Volunteers, and like anything else you can read by her because she's amazing. And Lee Harris's book, Energy Speaks. That's another one where there's several books that I could probably recommend, but that's my favorite. Finally, The Secret of Water by Masaru Emoto. Just a bit of light reading to prepare you for next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate you all and hope that you are enjoying the podcast so far. Again, let me know if you have any questions, if there's any topics you would like to discuss, or if I can help point in the right direction. Until next time, thank you.